Welcome everybody. We from York would like to acknowledge that the area known as Toronto is a territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Mississauga of the Credit River, and Métis Nation. Today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. On the behalf of University of British Columbia Vancouver campus, we would like to acknowledge the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The land we are situated on has always been a place of learning for its peoples, who for millennia have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next. Decolonization and reconciliation are especially relevant to the Palestinian people. We at PSC and SPHR stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island as in their struggle for liberation. As settlers on this land, it is important that we join Indigenous peoples in the fight against colonialism. The fight against colonialism is a global one, whether it be in Palestine, South Africa, Tamal Alam, Turtle Island, and beyond. We encourage all of you to seek to do your own land acknowledgements where you are at. Seek to understand, as put by Northwestern University, the longstanding history that has brought you to reside on the land, and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is an ongoing, current process, and we need to build our mindfulness in our present participation. Beyond this, we remind you that Indigenous peoples across the world continue to live and thrive, and while your personal land acknowledgements should respect the lived history and current reality of colonialism, they should strive to honor and serve as living celebrations of Indigenous communities today. So we are the PSC and SPHR clubs. We're the Palestinian Solidarity Clubs at York and UBC. We advocate for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions of the apartheid Israeli state. We educate about Palestine, and we have Palestinian cultural events as well. I'd like to pass it over to Jasmine now, who will introduce our incredible speakers.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Logan. So welcome, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. My name is Jasmine Hawamde. I use she and her pronouns. I'm originally from Queens, New York. I currently reside in Toronto, Ontario. However, I'm a proud daughter of the Palestinian diaspora. My family is originally from Ankara in Palestine. So today, we will be discussing the increasing normalization with Israel and how to resist through the law, boycotts, social media, fashion, protests, and the arts. I am so honored to introduce these phenomenal panelists, and I'm opening up the virtual floor for you folks to tell us a little bit about yourselves, starting with Miko.
Oh, okay. Hi. Thank you, Jasmine, and thanks, Logan, for the acknowledgements. I think these acknowledgements are really wonderful, and they're good to hear. And I look forward to the day where all settler colonial states will come to the realization that they need to do this, and particularly in Palestine. I think obviously Palestinians don't need to do this, but people like myself and in this particular panel, I'm really the one, European colonizer, need to, I think when people become aware of just how important it is, then there'll be a really big step in the right direction. Well, I'm the white European colonizer. That's where I come from. That's my background. That's really my story. I grew up as an Israeli in a Zionist family. Couldn't be more Zionist, couldn't be more involved in the state of Israel, couldn't be more rooted in this, in the mythology and this legacy, false legacy of Zionism. And then at one point in my life, I took this journey from the sphere of the colonizer, the white privileged colonizer, as Fanon says, where the roads are paved and the water runs freely and it's safe and secure, to the sphere of the other, to the sphere of these people who live not 5 minutes away from me and my friends and my family and people like me, and who live in an entirely different reality. And that journey, that step, even though geographically is really short, because Palestine is a small country and the two communities are always very close to each other geographically, that was a big step. That was a game changer for me. And the conclusion that I reached, eventually was that I had to make a choice. I either stand and support and legitimize the settler colonialism, the violence, and the racism that is the legacy of where I come from, my people, so to speak, my family, or I reject it, and I live a life where I promote values that are greater values like equality, like humanity, and so forth, and then resist apartheid and fight to end this legitimacy of the apartheid regime in Palestine. And that was a choice that I made. The choice is to stand up and talk about the reality and reveal the truth that many people are still not aware of, and stand with the people who fight for justice in Palestine. So that's my story.
Thank you so much. So I'll be opening up the virtual floor to Diana now to tell us a little bit about herself.
Thank you very much. Thank you first for acknowledging what needs to be acknowledged. And I want to also thank the organizers. Thank you, Logan. Thank you, Jasmine. And then, of course, my co-panelists, Lena and Miko, two people I'm honored to be sharing the floor with. My personal story is a little bit different than Miko's. I was born in Canada to Palestinian parents and raised in Canada. And at the time I was living in Canada, it was a little bit different than I think it was today, which is to say that there was, and there still continues to be, an attempt to either erase or gloss over Canada's colonization, Canada's land theft. And so I was very much grew up in that environment, in that atmosphere. I came to Palestine for the first time at an age when I could understand, during the first uprising, during the first Intifada. And for me, seeing the images of Palestinians finally being, finally resisting or being inside and showing their strength and their power was, for me, as somebody who was young at the time, very powerful. And I committed myself after being here, that I was just here for a short period, that I wanted to move to Palestine, to live in Palestine, and that I wanted to really work on freedom for us, freedom for our people. Plus, I don't think that Canada needs more settlers. So for me, I eventually, I was educated in Canada and then also in the US, and eventually made my way back to Palestine, where I have lived here now for quite some time. During my period here, I served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team. I served as one of the lawyers that challenged and successfully won the case against Israel's wall. I've been an activist, lived in the West Bank, lived in the Gaza Strip, and live here now in Haifa. Different types of colonization, different types of racism, different levels of oppression, but the root is one, which is Zionism. And so most recently now, a lot of my work is focusing both on trying to defend Palestinian homes from being demolished, defend Palestinian schools from being demolished, and also working closely to try to get people to understand exactly what it means to live under Israeli military rule, to live under Israeli apartheid, and just the impact of Zionism on its victims. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you for sharing and telling us a little bit more about yourself, Diana. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Lena, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, absolutely. So as you guys know, my name is Lena Hadid. I am one of the 15 grandchildren of Anwar and Khair Hadid, my grandparents, who were in 1948 violently forced out of their home in Nazareth, although my grandfather's from Safed, but he was working in Nazareth. They were violently forced out, and they had 4 children at the time. My grandmother was 27, of whom my mother and my Khala Muhammad and my auntie Raida and auntie Sanaa were the 4. They went to Syria, never ever thinking that they weren't going to return immediately, and ended up having another 4 children in Syria. My grandfather took a job after working with the Syrian government, with the US State Department, Voice of America. And they, after Syria, Lebanon, Tunisia, and Greece, landed in the United States. I am from the capital of the United States, and I am Palestinian American, obviously. I have been an activist since I was very, very young. I was a Brownie, a Girl Scout, president of the Civics Club, nonstop, cheerleader, always some form of activism and really civic duty, president of Tri-High Y, the Civics Club, etc. And then when I got to college, and I was around 17, 18, I became a political activist, and I was a member of the General Union of Palestinian Students. And I actually held a chair, which was very rare for a female. So I got indoctrinated very quickly. This was also, the Intifada was on fire. I was furious. I had a sense of justice since I was very young. My grandfather studied law and was a journalist. I was very sensitive to justice, and I just got super involved from day one. So I have an undergraduate degree in the School of Public Affairs. I have a doctorate of law, and I have a postdoctorate in negotiations. I made a conscious decision not to study public international law, although I really wanted to. So I went more for international business transactions, and I have a very, interesting, hardcore background in complex dispute resolutions with a top firm in the capital. And then I decided to take a move to Europe, Paris, and I decided to kind of change my negotiations from dealing with toxic torts and insurance defense litigation to other areas. So meanwhile, always being an activist. And then in 2015, with my co-founder, Wasim Mamlouk, we both started with the PYO in Washington at the same time. We decided to start the Palestine lobby. So that was in 2015, and well, it's been 5 years. So I still have a private practice, but about 50% of my time is activism.
That's phenomenal. I think we have a very diverse panel today, and I think all of your individual lived experiences will definitely bring a different taste and perspective on every question. Before we get started, I would like to remind the audience that there is a Q&A box. So throughout the entire panel, please feel free to drop a question, let us know what's up, what are you thinking, what's in your head, and at the end of the panel, we'll try our best to answer all of them. So now, are we ready to get started? Yeah, okay, awesome. So the first question is actually for you, Diana. So what is apartheid and what makes Israel an apartheid state? Could you also touch on the Nakba and how the Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people continues today? It's a very big question, but yeah.
How long do you have? No, thanks. I'll start with what is apartheid. Look, apartheid exists when you have different laws on the same territory that differentiate against people based on different characteristics. So in the case of South Africa, the characteristics that existed there, and that's where the word apartheid came about, it meant separateness, was on the basis of color, race. In the case of Palestine, there is apartheid, but it's not on the basis of color, race, but on the basis of what Israel describes as your nation, i.e., what your religion is. And the way that it's practiced in Israel is, and I want to be clear, I want to be absolutely clear here. Some people will say that there's only apartheid in the West Bank. because there are settlers living in the West Bank. I want to be clear in saying that apartheid is practiced all throughout historic Palestine. In other words, Israel practices Palestine, not just in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, but also against Palestinian citizens of Israel. As I was mentioning earlier, I am one. How does it do that? Israel affords different status and different rights based on whatever religion you are. So, and I will give you some examples as to how that plays out in practice. Let's first look at the West Bank. If you look at the West Bank as a territory, you've got approximately now 25% of the population of the West Bank are Israeli settlers. Now that 25% population have superior rights than the remaining 75% living on the land. How? One example is that they don't require, they live under civilian law and not under military law, which is to say that if two individuals commit the exact same crime, the Israeli, the settler, will face a criminal charge in a civilian court. The Palestinian, same crime, will face an Israeli military court, with the sentences being completely different. What's the distinction? Simply on the basis of their quote unquote nation, i.e. their religion. If you look also though, it doesn't just stop there. And this is why I was saying that it's so important for us to recognize this. There is no magic line at the green line. It's also practiced inside Israel. And there are scores of laws, there's close to 60 laws that are on the books that either directly or indirectly discriminate against Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And I'll give you a couple of examples so that you're able to understand. So one law that is directly discriminatory, discriminates on its face, is a law that's called the law of return. And what that law allows is that it allows any person who is Jewish from anywhere around the world, no connection, to come and to settle in Israel, including in the West Bank, and to become a citizen. Whereas for that same right is not given to Palestinians who are citizens of the state. And it's a little bit more personal than that for me. My parents, I didn't go into this, but both my parents were born in Palestine. They predate the state of Israel. My father's family fled in 1948. And one of the individuals who fled with him was his older sister. She was born in Palestine. She was educated in Palestine. She got married in Palestine. She had her first child in Palestine. In 1948, she fled as a result of the Nakba, the Zionist forces coming into our hometown, Limjadel, by the way, Lena, we're also from Nazareth. And she was never able to return to her home in Limjadel for one reason, only one reason: she's not Jewish. So when you look at, that's one law that directly on its face discriminates against Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. But there are other laws that also discriminate, whether it's everything from who you have the right to marry, to the types of professions that you can obtain, to whether allocations are given to services for Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. There's lots of much more subtle ways that the state actively discriminates and sets up an apartheid regime with superior rights for Israelis and for Jewish Israelis, and then lower levels of rights for Palestinians. And so you see that all throughout the system. There will be many who will tell you that it's apartheid only in the West Bank because of this superior set of laws, but that is not the case. And it's very important for us to recognize that the foundation of the state, the way that the state was founded, was to grant superior rights to one group of people, being Israeli Jews, and everybody else being inferior. And so on the basis of its very founding, there's the apartheid is worked into it. Most recently, which is a couple of years ago, 2018, Israel passed the Jewish nation state law, which should actually just be called the Jewish privilege, Jewish supremacy law. And that has now enshrined the system of apartheid, even within Israel's own regime. So it's very clear. People here, Jasmine, they talk about it very openly. They talk about apartheid, and I live in Haifa, they talk about it very openly in an unabashed way. And this is why I think it's very important for us to continue to press home and for people to realize just how proud they are of having this system of discrimination in place.
That was very insightful. I found it very inspiring that you actually returned to Palestine as a Palestinian who's never been, also to share all of that insight about how enshrined apartheid really is throughout the entire state. Because, you know, as someone who's never been, I've only ever heard, you know, apartheid is only in the West Bank. And so you definitely clarified a lot for me as an outsider. So our next question is for Miko. In replying to the question of whether or not Zionists had a valid claim to the historic land of Palestine, Edward Said, may he rest in peace, once said, "Of course, but the Zionist claim is not the only claim or the main claim. Both the Jews and the Arabs have a claim, but I don't think any claim overrides all the others, and entitles that person with a so-called claim to drive people out." So in the light of that view, how do you believe we as Palestinians or Palestinian Solidarity members should respond to Zionists who justify the occupation of Palestinian land as a form of reclamation of the land from which they exiled in 70 AD?
Well, I think there's two issues. There are two issues here. The first one is, does Zionism have any kind of legitimacy? Or the claims of Zionism that somehow they are a national, kind of a national liberation movement that is allowing the Jews who were wronged 2,000 years ago to return to their historic homeland. And then the other question is the rights of Israeli Jews who currently live in Palestine, or what they call Israel. So the first part, do the Zionism have any legitimacy, and do these claims have any legitimacy? I believe they have no legitimacy whatsoever. First of all, I don't know any Jewish person anywhere in the world that can trace their roots back to Palestine 2,000 years ago. In other words, the idea that somehow all Jewish people throughout the entire world are somehow connected to an ancient tribe that resided in parts of Palestine 3,000 years ago, and therefore have a right to return today at the expense of people who have been living there and live there currently is absurd. I mean, think about it for a minute, you know? So I think the entire premise, the entire claim of Zionism is baseless and has no legitimacy whatsoever. This claim that Jews somehow have a right. And if we look at, if you look at Judaism itself as a religion, and the way Judaism defines its connection to its identity as a nation, according to the strict most, and Judaism is a religion. You know, the Zionists turned it into a nationality. Judaism is a religion. According to the very definition of Jewish law itself, Jews are not united as a nation by a land or a language, but by their faith in the Almighty and their following of the laws of the Torah. That's it. That's why you have Jews who are Yemenites and Jews who are Polish, and they can call themselves a nation, not because they are a nation in the modern sense of the word, but because they're united by this faith. Zionists came and said, no. Jews are a nation like other nations. The Bible, the Old Testament, which has absolutely no historic value whatsoever, or historic relevance or legitimacy whatsoever, is our history book. Oh, and Palestine is our homeland. Boom, now you have Zionism, and now suddenly there's this legitimacy. And today when you talk to people, I don't know if you guys know or have read Normalizations book, 4,000 Palestine, a 4,000 year history. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. You know, it is, I've never seen anything that is like it, that is focused only on the history of Palestine, on the history, not on the biblical, mythology. But if you talk, people read, I have friends who I recommended this book to, and they got angry because that contradicts what they learned in church. Never mind people who are Jewish and Zionists and have their own set of. So that part, that I don't believe that Zionism has any kind of legitimacy whatsoever. But the claim that Jewish people have some kind of rights to Palestine is absolutely has no foundation whatsoever. Even if it's true, and even if all the Jews could trace their roots back to 3,000 years ago, it still wouldn't be a legitimate claim. And then when you look at the campaign of ethnic cleansing, when you look at the apartheid regime that Diana just described that had been put in place, when you look at the violence and what I believe is as a campaign of genocide that the Zionists have been involved in for all these decades, then certainly you can't legitimize this if you have any kind of sense of morality, or even if you look at international law, there's no way that this can be legitimate. Now, the other part of the question is the rights of Israeli Jewish people who live there now. And I compare them to the whites of South Africa, people like myself. We are not indigenous. We are not organic. Whites in South Africa are not indigenous or organic to South Africa, but there are white South Africans because of the history of settler colonialism, because of the reality and what took place in South Africa, and the same in Palestine. Now there's this new creation. It's Israelis. It's a new nation. It's a new kind of a thing. And they're there. There's some 6 million of them, and they're there in Palestine. And that's part of the reality. And I don't think there's any argument that they have a right to live in peace and so on and so forth, but not at the expense of anybody else, not as a superior race, not as masters of the land, not without recognizing the rights of the Palestinians, not without recognizing the Nakba and what it meant, and not without recognizing that Palestinians have a right to return and be paid reparation and compensation for what has happened over the last 7 decades or 8 decades, or actually close to 100 years. So under certain circumstances, I don't think Israelis have legitimacy. I think today what exists in what they call Israel today has no legitimacy, and that should be made absolutely clear in every conversation that we have. There cannot be any legitimacy to the existence of the state of Israel and Israeli citizenship for people like myself as it exists today. In a different context, in a post-colonial Palestine, in a decolonized Palestine, and I'll just throw in another book that I just read and I just happened to write a review about. It's called the Palestinian Refugees in International Law. And it's an incredible study, and it puts things in place, and it talks about the strength of the claims and the validity and legitimacy of the claims of Palestinian refugees to this day, and the fact that Israel has to be accountable and be held accountable to compensate, pay reparations, and allow for the return. So under that kind of a circumstance, yes, Israelis, of course, have a right to remain and live in peace and so on and so forth, but not in the way that Israel exists today. So I hope that answers the question.
That does answer the question. I'm also looking for comments, or if Lena or Diana, I'm opening up the virtual floor for you folks to add about how do you respond to the justification of the occupation of the Palestinian land. So if you folks would like to add, please feel free.
There is no justification. This is these are all, so, these are all like fictions that the Zionists love to create. And you hear these justifications all the time. They'll say things like, well, the Palestinian Authority is corrupt. Well, there's corruption in France. There's corruption in the United States. There's corruption in Canada. It doesn't mean that people aren't entitled to be free. But I think that we've been going down the path that they have gone down is to try to justify the occupation when it needs to be turned on to its head, which is to say, how is it that in this day and age, we are still discussing and still defending the denial of freedom of a people, and that we're still discussing and defending the bombing of places like Gaza, the closing down, the colonization of Palestinian land, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the tearing down of schools. We have schools here that get torn down, the tearing down of houses. I mean, everything is on its head, and so there is no justification to the claims that they make. And instead, it needs to be and must be turned on its head. The big problem is that so many people have drunk the Kool-Aid that they continue to ask us these questions about that we have to somehow prove ourselves worthy of having our freedom, when it's exactly the opposite. We should never have to prove anything to anybody. We are entitled to our freedom because we are alive, and it should be Israel that is on the defensive. And this is why, for me, for Miko, for Lena, the issue of BDS just becomes so important.
That was very powerful. And the fact that you started with "there is no justification," that was clear, that was powerful. And I'm going to use that when arguing with Zionists on my day-to-day life. So most Palestinians can trace their ancestry as far as 9 generations back on the historic land of Palestine. I really appreciated the fact that Lena and Diana, you both introduced yourselves and also mentioned as Palestinian, but also mentioning where your families are from, right? To keep that is very powerful. To talk about where we're from and where my grandfather was born, like he's born in Ankarim, you know, I really hope to one day visit his home. So, and yet, as we all know, that Palestinians are denied the right to live on their lands, while many Jewish people, whether ethnically or religiously, have been granted the Israeli citizenship, despite having no prior connection to the land. What does this information mean about the Zionist claim to the land of Palestine, and that their occupation of Palestine is a form of return to their homeland? How can Palestinians react, and how do we do, and what should we expect from their end as well? I'm opening up the floor to anybody.
Well, Lena hasn't spoken yet, so she would.
I know, but I'm a little confused. Are we talking about Zionism? I was actually going to comment after Diana, so I got sidetracked. But I am going to read a quote that one of my favorite Palestinian journalists, Hadi Abu Nima from the Electronic Intifada, said recently. He said that Zionism is a system founded on a denial of the existence of the Palestinian people. Zionism is a system that always has and still does seek to destroy the Palestinian people. Our problem is Zionism. And if you look back all the way to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, you'll see that when our land was misappropriated, was actually handed over from one white Englishman to one white Jewish man, who was actually the head of the Zionist movement, Sir Rothschild, when there weren't any Palestinians involved in the declaration. There were no Palestinians, there were no signatories, there weren't any discussions. So they were already misappropriating land. And then they kind of used, and in my personal opinion, having been raised in a Judeo-Christian environment, they used Judaism as a tool to actually enforce Zionism. And they kind of, they started this propaganda machine that started from the very beginning, that it was a land with no people. And clearly we were people. I mean, we were 1.5 million people, right? We existed, we are Palestinian. And then overnight, that propaganda machine 103 years later is still working. And it's a Zionist propaganda machine, and it's very scary. And we actually have to, there's nothing we can do. We actually have to go back and kind of retrace history and explain to people that they actually have been misinformed for the last 103 years. And that's where we are today, and I mean, as far as I understand, we are the only country being occupied. You've got 5 million people that are actually being occupied in the world in 2020. And this is continuing to, and it's not stopping. It's just getting worse and worse. And actually, to date, we've even lost Palestine. We really don't have any more Palestine. So all we are looking to do, at least people like myself in the lobby, is to at least secure fundamental human rights or civil rights for the Palestinians that, you know, live in an apartheid system, but it's actually worse than apartheid, this colonial oppression. It's worse. So there's a huge aspect of it that's apartheid, but it's even worse than apartheid. So, you know, we have a lot of work to do, but there aren't enough people, there aren't enough good people out there fighting the fight. There are just too many people that are silent. And many of them are actually Palestinian. And I understand, because I myself and my own family, I mean, it is very hard for people to identify themselves as Palestinians. I'm from the from the capital of the US. Every time people look at me, just because I look a little exotic, and they say, "Where are you from?" I say, "Palestinian American." Since I was a little girl, they tell me I don't exist. That's very difficult. You know, I mean, that's some major cultural identity. And since I've never carried a Palestinian passport because my family are Nakba survivors, in fact, I'm American, you know, so that's the passport I carry. So it's easier to say you're American or you're French or you're Syrian or you're Lebanese than to say it is you're Palestinian, because we've just been subjected to so much propaganda over the last 103 years. We've got, you know, the most powerful lobby against us in the United States, and we've got Israel. And I mean, I'm sorry, but, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu, that guy's amazing. He runs that country like a company. You know, he does not run that that country like a country. He runs it like a company, and it's a company, you know, that's very limited and who can be, you know, shareholders, etc. So you know, we've got a serious problem, and we all need to kind of get together and fight it as much as we can. And I really think that it's going to be the new generation, really the 18 to 24-year-olds, that are actually going to make a push in history, because I find that anyone over 25 years old today is extremely jaded when it comes to the Palestinian issue, unfortunately. And that's because, you know, just there's too much propaganda. Everything is against us. You know, when Rupert Murdoch owns, you know, the media, you can understand that we're not getting our fair share in the game.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to add to that?
I'll say something. Somebody asked a question about the IHRA, and I think it relates to this, because this is part of that story that's been going on, like Lena was saying, for, you know, over 100 years. The latest chapter in this mythology, in the story, is this new definition of anti-Semitism, which was created in order to defend Israel. And that's what the IHRA stands for, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, kind of an obscure organization that came out with a new definition for anti-Semitism, which is really created as a shield for Israel. In other words, they took everything that Israel can be accused of, or should be accused of, in its crimes in Palestine, and defined as, pointing it out as anti-Semitism. Not the fact that Israel is engaged in all these crimes is racism. Pointing it out is racism, because anti-Semitism, you know, the simple definition of anti-Semitism is racism directed at Jewish people. Now they've added all of this, and the question here in the Q&A is, how do we resist it? And I think the way to resist it is to reject it wholly and completely, and point out that it is nothing but a shield, a piece of propaganda to shield Israel from its crimes in Palestine. And they've done a really good job, the Zionists, in getting both governmental and non-governmental organizations, so political parties, states, universities, and so on, to accept that definition, which makes all of us anti-Semitic immediately. So now they can claim that anybody who criticizes Israel is anti-Semitic, and poor little Israel is just defending itself against racism. And of course, all Palestinians must be anti-Semitic, because they fall under those categories as well. So I think the way to resist it is to reject it completely, and to point out that it is absolutely nothing but a piece of propaganda to shield a racist regime from people pointing out that it is a racist regime.
I'd like to say something also, that the country that is aiding and abetting Israel is really the United States, more than anyone else. And people need to understand that. They need to understand to what level. And as everyone knows, we now have a new head of state, which is wonderful. And of course, you know, we all have to respect him, but he has openly pronounced himself a Zionist. I mean, we're talking about he has openly said in multiple forums that he is a Zionist and that he has been a Zionist since he was a child. So that is extremely disturbing because we have 80 million Christian Zionists in the United States, and this is a movement. I mean, this is not going to fare well, obviously, for the Palestinians right now, because this is a racist ideology, and it's not me who decided it. It's not Miko, and it's certainly not Diana. I mean, it is the United Nations. I mean, there are member states, and it was decided that this is a racist ideology, and we do have to treat it that way. It's a form of fascism. We can't just, now in Europe, for instance, sorry, just one more thing, President Macron, he tried to pass a law making people like myself who are anti-Zionist, calling us anti-Semitic and treating us as if we are committing hate crimes. It's very disturbing that there is this sentiment in Europe, and that there's so much lobbying going on in Europe where we can't even criticize the state of Israel. And we certainly cannot criticize Zionists today because we are considered anti-Semitic. I mean, we also have to get clear on this whole anti-Semitism. It's just become anything you say about the state of Israel, you're branded anti-Semitic, period, end of story. And if you're of the Jewish faith, it's even worse, I feel. If you're anti-Zionist, it's very difficult, and you must get a lot of death threats, Nico.
Not really. I don't actually.
No. I get them for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
I've made more friends since I become since I've been doing this work than I ever thought I would have. So I can't claim to have any death threats. No, nothing at all.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear you're safe, because I feel like a lot of Palestinian activists definitely face a lot of violence, even for just identifying themselves as Palestinian growing up. It's not easy. In Ontario, our provincial parliament passed Bill 168, which defines anti-Semitism as also being anti-Zionist, which is very dangerous in the province, seeing as there are a lot of young Palestinian organizers within post-secondary institutions. So yeah, thank you folks for commenting. Diana, would you like to add?
Yeah, so, maybe because I worked a little bit in the provincial and then in the federal system, how do you push back against it is you need to organize. Just in the same way that the Zionists managed to push through the definition without any real discussion or debate, so too we can push through a repeal of this. Plus, I also think it's very important for this to be challenged in court. And I think that this is very much a wake-up call for the other provinces as well. Look, we've seen this coming for quite some time. In Europe, this has been going forward for quite some time. There's been an attempt to try to equate any criticism of Israel as being equivalent to anti-Semitism. And obviously we know that that's not the case. Just in the same way that if you criticize the policies of, let's say, Pakistan or Iran or Saudi Arabia, three confessional states alongside Israel, those three states would not be labeled Islamophobic. So too, criticism of Israel is not obviously anti-Semitic. It's criticism of an actual state, and we should be entitled to actually criticize a state that is an apartheid state, that is an ethnic cleanser, and so on. And so the big thing that needs to happen is, I'm hoping that both while you're in your studies and after you finish your studies, that you use this energy and fuel it into a lot of political activism, activism that's both directed at the legislature level, but also within courts, within grassroots movements, and also with the media. Absent doing that, then we're going to see these attempts to continue to steamroll these definitions and push them through. And this is exactly what the Zionists want. For such a long time, they have been effectively, they've been arm wrestling with nobody and winning, obviously. And so, it's really vital for us to be pushing back, to be organized, and to be pushing back with all of the allies that we have to make sure that this gets stopped.
And I just want to say one thing about the universities, and I don't know if I've shared this with you, but I share it with all the universities I speak at. You have to understand that AIPAC, the American Israeli Lobby, they have handbooks at every major university they have handbooks on how to deal with activists, people like you and people like me. They actually produce a handbook every year. Very difficult to get your hands on it, but I have copies, and they're scary because they'll tell you about specific professors, they'll tell you about specific activists, they'll tell you about the type of events, they'll tell you about the arguments. I mean, they're methodical. It's amazing. They actually produce these and hand them out to the Zionist students. It's extremely it's dangerous. And honestly, you guys have been through a lot in the last year, and being vocal is very important. And I actually regret a few times where I was not actually vocal enough. I should have gone to the police. I should go to the police more often. These kind of threats are completely ridiculous. And they're hate crimes, and we should be reporting them just like everyone else reports their hate crimes.
That actually leads into my next question, Lena. I really appreciate talking about reporting and honestly acknowledging our violence, because we don't do that enough as a community, because we've faced so much for so long that I think, you know, we're so strong, we just keep moving and it's like, yalla, yalla, it's okay, adi, but it's not okay. It's definitely not okay. So why is activism on campuses or by students and young activists across the world important for the Palestinian cause? Both of you already touched on that, but I'm opening up the virtual floor for all three of you to comment.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in on that one. I think that, and I usually say it in the beginning when I speak, when I'm in events that are hosted by students, I don't think you guys even begin to appreciate the enormous contribution that you are making to the cause of justice in Palestine. And this is true throughout the United States. It's true in Canada. It's true in Europe. The work that you guys do, whether SJP, SPHR, Palestine Solidarity, the work that you do, the level that you have raised the conversation on Palestine throughout the world is not anything anybody could have anticipated. And as we all know, and I'm sure all three of us panelists agree, you're challenged by the environment, you're challenged by the administration, you're challenged by all the Zionist handbooks and pamphlets and the Canary Mission and all of that, all that stuff that's out there and is scary. I mean, I can't, you know, and you know what I'm talking about because you're in it, and you do it anyway. And not only you do it, but it's growing every day, every week, every new term. There are new voices, new organizations that express the Palestinian voice on campuses. It's only growing, and you're doing more and more every year. And again, when you guys are older, you look back, and a free democratic Palestine is a reality. You know, you're going to look back with a lot of pride that you had. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. The role that you guys play in actually bringing about or creating a reality where a free Palestine can become a reality. Your contribution is second to none. I mean, possibly the BDS call, the BDS movement. But you guys are right up there. So, you know, well done, and my hat's off to all of you, and keep it up. And I know it's scary. I mean, I know so many students, and I know how scary it is, and I know how threatening it is, but you're doing the right thing, and this is the right fight, and you're on the right side of history. So that's my little 2 cents worth on that.
Thank you so much. Would any other panelists like to comment?
Absolutely. I mean, I've been an activist since I was very young, in my teens, and I think that activism is extremely important. What I find the most difficult is to actually get people to join the right side of history, and it really is the right side of history. I didn't make up that hashtag for any reason. I mean, it is the right side of history. So we have to be, we need to lobby. We have to lobby at every level. And the 18 to 24, your target audience, university students, this is a learning environment, and this is when you can actually convert people, so to speak. You know, I mean, they just need to hear the right side because they've been fed this Zionist propaganda their entire lives, and so have their parents, you know, and grandparents in many cases. So activism is absolutely key. And I am one of the first people to always, give help to any of the student universities, associations, whether it be in Europe or in the US. And I think you have to call upon us, the Palestinian professionals out there who have been through this. I think you have to call upon us so that we can help you with your strategy and in any other way we can. One thing that I do regret is that from my first debate, when I had my car, I was 19 years old, and they spray painted Palestinian horror across my car and put something in the gas tank. Um, and I was lucky to have my father present. We never told my mother about it. She knows about it now. From that moment, I should have fought back. I managed to get the head of, the fraternity suspended for 6 months, but that wasn't enough. The death threats that I've received, getting like that wasn't enough. I should have screamed louder. And I think that's a lesson that we have to learn, is that we really have to be vocal about the abuse. And yeah, you're right. The other day, an older Jewish man spit on me because I was wearing a kufiya in the middle of the street in Europe. And that was outrageous. You have to stop, you have to call the police, and we have to report these hate crimes, because we're only being hated because we exist. I mean, the hate is only due, it's because we exist. And I'm sure Miko's sister. She's written some very interesting books. I mean, actually scary, books about the Israeli education system. And they really do teach hate, and they profess hate, and then that's propaganda, and then it's reiterated, and people hate us, and they don't even know why they hate us. They just hate us because we're Palestinian and we're not supposed to exist.
And the entire premise of Zionism and the state of Israel, I mean, it is a hate crime. Zionism and the state of Israel are a hate crime. It's not that the state of Israel commits crimes. It is a hate crime. Its very existence is a hate crime.
Exactly. Well said.
That's very powerful. So, Miko, you did mention BDS. I'm opening up this question to everybody. Seeing as so many student organizations are pro-BDS and try to implement BDS on individual campuses across America, Canada, Europe, etc. Could you folks explain why BDS is a valid form of resistance against the Israeli state and why it should be pursued?
Well, I mean, any resistance against the state of Israel is legitimate. So, I mean, and BDS is one of those forms. I think for people like us who live on the outside, particularly, BDS is a gift. I mean, it was a gift that it was given us to us by the Palestinian civil society. It's a pathway that defines very clearly what it is we should be calling for. In other words, the demands of BDS are very, very clear. They're simple. There's only 3 of them. Anybody can read them and understand them. And the methods are methods that have been proven time and time again. And certainly, if you go back to the example of apartheid South Africa, everybody I met in South Africa said, thanks to BDS, apartheid fell. And I would really encourage people to study and take a look at the demand of the call for BDS, because again, it goes back to people accusing even myself as anti-Semitic because I wear this BDS badge and so on. And we know that the state of Israel is terrified and is investing enormous amounts of effort and money and propaganda in order to fight BDS. But when we look at the demands of the call for BDS, which is again a Palestinian-led call, a Palestinian-led movement, if you will, they're very simple. They're remedial. They don't call to hurt anyone. They don't call to expel anyone. They call for the return of the refugees, which has already been sanctioned by international law. They call for ending the military occupation in parts of Palestine where there's still a military occupation, and they call for equal rights. These are three demands that couldn't be more reasonable, and have all been sanctioned by international law and make perfect sense. And they all remedy the reality in which Palestinians were placed because of the state of Israel, because of Zionism. It doesn't call to kick anybody out, to hurt anyone, to expel anyone. This is all very positive, remedial, reasonable. Anybody can understand it, and all of them have been already sanctioned by international law, and by anyone who has a sense of morality can understand that these 3 demands are perfectly reasonable demands that should be there should be a response to them. They should be accepted. So I encourage anybody and everybody who cares, even remotely cares about Palestine, remotely cares about justice, remotely cares about human rights and civil rights of people, to get behind BDS, to wear the badge, to call for BDS, to organize in their local communities, on campuses, in their synagogues or churches, wherever the case may be, and to promote this idea that BDS, that elected officials must support BDS. You know, now in Congress, I think there's at least 2 more new members of Congress here in the U.S. who came out you know, publicly in support of BDS. That's enormous. You know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if we talk, or when BDS came out, if we talked about this, it would have seemed like an absurd proposition that there'd be members of Congress who openly support the call for boycott against Israel. So I think it's moving in the right direction. I think it's the right thing to do. I think we just need to expand it. We need to explain to people why they need to support it. We need to organize, you know, like Diana said, that's really the key, to organize and expand, and to speak about it, and to make sure people understand that you cannot be a supporter of justice, you cannot be a supporter of freedom, you cannot be a supporter of Palestine and be Zionist. You can't do both. One contradicts the other, and therefore I believe we have to support and get behind the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
Phenomenal. Would anybody like to add?
I will. I think the BDS, Omar Barghouti, the whole group, it's just absolutely essential that every single person on the right side of history, not just Palestinian, engages and practices. Not that difficult, even just the basics of BDS. It obviously worked in South Africa. That's obviously the model we're using, and there's no reason that it can't work. Economic sanctions are the only way to go. But more so than that, I find that these days I've been doing a lot of lobbying, trying to encourage corporations to be socially conscious, because I don't think it's in anyone's best interest to be doing business with the state of Israel. I'll probably get shot for that statement, but I mean, I really believe it. I think that until they clean up their act and allow at least basic civil rights for Palestinians, the indigenous population, they should not be allowed to do all business with all of these, you know, huge corporations all around the world. It's, you know, today we need to be socially conscious. We need to know who we are doing business with. You know, it's BDS 100% all the way, and we all need to push it. In Europe, it's been very difficult. They are trying everything they can do in all of Central Europe not to allow BDS to even exist, not to allow us to organize, not to allow any, even just to practice. They're saying, they even tried to go so far as to say that if you intentionally don't purchase or engage in, you know, business with these Israeli companies, then which means that you're basically practicing BDS, that you could be held anti-Semitic. That's basically what's happening today. It's extremely scary, meaning someone wants to tell me that I have to buy Israeli dates, because if I consciously want to buy the Tunisian dates and not the Israeli dates, you know, I'm anti-Semitic. That's what they're saying. It's exactly what they're saying.
But are you Islamophobic for not buying Saudi dates?
Let's please not talk about KSA.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, we need like a full day seminar on that. God help us.
Right.
Yeah.
Diana, would you like
these
to
days,
add?
I think
so
what's
sorry.
yeah. That's one of your future questions, but basically what's going to happen is, you know, it's going to be that group, you know, that pack. Yeah.
Diana, would you like to add to that?
Yes. Look, you know, I think it's important to put BDS into its proper context. So prior to BDS, the BDS call came in 2005, in July of 2005. And so you have to ask the question, why did it happen in July of 2005? And the reason is that it came on the heels of the decision by the International Court of Justice, where the International Court of Justice comes forward and says Israel's wall is illegal, and its entire regime that's associated with the wall, meaning the settlements, the settler roads, the different laws that are in place, etc., that all of that is illegal. And on top of being illegal, that no third country should be aiding or participating or doing anything to support this. And so, so the first thing that we did, if you think back in history, was we first tried negotiations, and it was obviously a big failure. You can't negotiate when you have a gun to your head. Then we tried a legal strategy and we waited for a year. And after a year, we saw that there was no state that was coming forward and cutting off its ties, neither with Israel, nor with the regime that was created for the wall, nor with the wall itself, including Canada, by the way. This is when the call for BDS then came about. It came about exactly 1 year to the day of the ICJ decision, the decision against Israel's wall. And so obviously it is, it's a legitimate way of, a legitimate tool. And it is a tool that we need to keep pushing and fostering, because we have, what the international community in particular, when I speak to some Canadian officials, US officials, and some other officials, they always say to me, well, we don't support BDS. And I say, okay, well, what do you support? Well, we support negotiations. I said, but when there were negotiations, you were never putting pressure on Israel. Yes, it's up to the two sides. And I said, all right, so then you really want us to be negotiating with a gun to our head. I mean, they don't have an answer in terms of what it is that they're going to do to liberate Palestine. They don't want to see us resist violently. They don't want to see us engaging in nonviolent resistance, such as through BDS. They're not going to do anything to put pressure on Israel. And so in effect, what the world has said to us is lay down, just accept the fact that you are lesser, and that you're going to have to live under military rule, denied your freedom, living under an apartheid regime. And quite frankly, we're not going to do that. We're not going to accept live under an apartheid regime. We're not going to accept to live under with the denial of freedom. We want to be free, and we demand to be free. And therefore, BDS is a very important tool. It's so important that when you look at what Israel has put its efforts on, they classify BDS as one of two main strategic threats. Iran is number one. Iran, a country that's doing some sort of nuclear program, is number one, and BDS is number two.
That's right.
Oh my God.
This is how absurd it is. They have a whole ministry that is designed to just focus on BDS and to try to counter BDS. They target BDS activists. They target people like me who are living in the country, who speak out against BDS. They've tried to criminalize any support for BDS by saying that if you openly speak about BDS, that firms can then try to seek damages from you without ever specifying what damage they have actually suffered, simply because you're speaking out against BDS. So you can see how much of a threat it is posing to Israel, because the idea that people have free will and can choose where it is that they want to buy, and who it is that they invite to their conferences, and who it is that they're doing these educational exchanges with, terrifies them. Israel, at the end of the day, wants to be treated as a normal state, but it is an abnormal state because it's an occupier, it's an oppressor, it's an ethnic cleanser. And this is the way that it has to be treated. And the only way that we're going to be able to push forward is to continue to push for it to be isolated through boycotts, through divestment, and through sanctions.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was very encouraging, especially for what I'm assuming a lot of university activists and students who have gotten really tired of constantly defending BDS. I feel like this is the good, power and amazing words and inspiration that we need to keep going. So as the general public, through BDS and other efforts, their perspectives change and see Palestinians and the fight for Palestinian liberation a legitimate fight, Arab countries seem to be moving backwards, unfortunately. And we've definitely seen that in the last couple weeks and months. The Arab countries' official normalizations with Israel means, what does the Arab countries' official normalizations with Israel mean for Palestine and the Palestinian identity? And how does this weaken the Palestinian stance and affect the possibility of Palestinian self-governance? I'm opening up the floor, but yeah, so who would like to start? Diana?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Look, this is, where do I begin? This is Israel. It's Israel's fantasy, right? They want to be viewed as being a normal state, and they want to have normalization and all of that stuff. And but look at who it is that they're normalizing with. They're normalizing weapons sales. That's what they're doing. These are business transactions and business deals, and they're normalizing with dictators and with despots, and that's what they want. And if that's the crowd that you want to hang with, by all means, do it. Do I think it's a smart move? Do I wish that these Arab countries would normalize with Israel? Obviously not. But it shows you something about just where it is that these regimes are and what it is that these regimes stand for. When you look at the Arab world as a whole, we're one of the few regions in the world where we have not had self-determination as a region, as a whole, the Arab people as a whole. The reason that we don't have self-determination is because of Israel. It's that simple. We have a colonizer, colonial presence in our midst. And rather than them standing with the people who are defending and who are pushing and demanding our liberation and our self-determination, not just for us, but for the region as a whole, they turn around and normalize relations with the very country that is the reason that we don't have self-determination. It shows you where their priorities lie and where it is what they're thinking of. They're thinking about acquiring more weapons so that they can bomb Yemen. They're thinking of acquiring more weapons so that they can take out action in Syria and so on and so forth. They're not thinking about us as people. They're thinking about repressing their own, particularly places like Bahrain and otherwise. The amazing thing, though, is that Israel can try to normalize and make itself appear as normal as possible. But at the end of the day, it knows that it's an occupier. It knows that it's an oppressor. It knows that it's an ethnic cleanser. And this is why, for all the fanfare that the Trump administration tried to pull off about, self-applauding, self-congratulatory for peace in the Middle East, here, there wasn't this congratulatory applause, even among Israelis. It wasn't this congratulatory applause. Because if you look at, for example, Bahrain and the UAE, their populations combined do not amount to the population of Gaza. Combined does not amount to the population of Gaza. So they can try as much as possible to normalize and make peace with all of these, with these dictatorships and with these various regimes. But the only way that they're ever going to have peace is if they finally acknowledge what they have done to us and what they have done to us and their military rule. Let us live in freedom, in dignity, and in equality. That's the only way that it's going to happen. Is our identity being affected by this? No. If you walk around and ask people what do they think of the normalization, most Palestinians here they're obviously shaking their head in disgust, feeling a sense that we've been stabbed in the back, which we have. But at the same time, people turn around and say, well, what did you expect? This is the way the regimes, this is the path that they've been going on for a long time, for several decades. What's amazing is that despite that, and this part, Jasmine, is very important. For years, Israel has been trying to normalize us, meaning Palestinians. They have been trying for decades to turn, whether it's Palestinian citizens of Israel, into good Israelis, or to turn Palestinians who are in the West Bank and Gaza Strip as people without a Hawi, without an identity. And they have not succeeded. In 7 decades, despite all of the pressure, the attempts to try to eliminate our language, to eliminate our presence, to eliminate everything that has to do with Palestine, to criminalize it, to do what it is that they want to do around the world, and you feel the brunt of it, they have not succeeded. And they will not succeed. They will not succeed because we are rooted in this land. We are of this land. And our identity is in no way related to them, and they know it.
I think the key word there is regimes. The normalization is with the regimes. We know that in Bahrain, there's a strong popular movement against the normalization. We know that in Sudan, there's a huge opposition to the normalization. We know that in Kuwait, there's there's no normalization with Kuwait, but they're already out there, very, very clearly against it. And the key word is the regimes. In other words, the Zionist regime who is an illegitimate regime in Palestine, is making connections with all these other regimes around the world. And Israelis know, and I think the reason, the thing Diana pointed out about Israelis not being excited, they've had normalized relations with Egypt and with Jordan for decades, and they call it a cold peace. You know, they were hoping that, you know, Egyptians and Jordanians would come in and shop in Tel Aviv and come to pray in Al-Aqsa. Nothing. And that is the real sign of where Arab people stand. You know, the regimes can do whatever the hell they want. They don't represent anyone. The people speak out. People do not go. You know, when you go through the terminal to cross to Jordan, you know, overland, it's empty. You don't see Jordanians coming. They're not going to come. I mean, you have a few people coming, but people don't come because Arabs stand, you know, the people of the Arab countries stand with Palestine, and the regimes can do whatever the hell they want. And you know, historically, the Zionists understood this, and they've made alliances with regimes, with Arab regimes all along, you know, by giving them money, providing them whatever it is that was relevant at the time. Now it's, you know, F-35 bombers. That's really the name of the game. But it's all about the regimes. It's this regime creating normalization, so to speak, or so-called, with other regimes. That's really the key. It has no legitimacy, just like the regimes and the state of Israel have no legitimacy.
Thank you.
I would just add to that. I listened to a speech that Omar Barouti gave recently, and he made it very clear that the Israelis have been trading already with these countries in the Gulf for the last 35 years. So obviously, and when you read these agreements, the Abraham's agreement, you understand that it's much more of a trade agreement than any sort of peace agreement, because these people, the Gulf and the Israelis, have never had problems. They don't have any conflicts and they don't have any issues. So this is not really a peace agreement. It's a complete misnomer. What I think this is all about is just your basic gangster capitalism. It's just that simple. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot of Arab Zionists now also. And I think we need to get ready for that, because we've had such a wave of Christian Zionists that now we're moving to the Arab Zionists. And again, I mean, this is not a religion. This is a racist ideology. And, you know, with gangster capitalism coupled with Zionism is basically what we're seeing today, in my opinion.
I love that, gangster capitalism. I'm gonna start using that in my everyday language. Yeah, I probably will. So, okay, let's shift gears a little bit. We talked about BDS, we talked about normalization with states, negotiations, etc. And as an artist, I'm very excited for this question about cultural appropriation. So Israel uses cultural appropriation as a tool to advance its colonial agenda and theft of historic Palestine. They have constantly claimed many different aspects of Palestinian culture, such as food and music, as their own, as an attempt to erase Palestinian identity. Is the appropriation of Palestinian culture by Israel an ethnic cleansing tool to facilitate the colonization of Palestinian land? I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to open up the floor for you folks to give a more interesting answer.
Absolutely, as the one non-Palestinian, you know, colonizer on the panel, I'll say absolutely. The whole idea that, you know, when I grew up as a kid, you know, in Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, you know, West Jerusalem was the ethnic cleansing of West Jerusalem was absolutely complete. There's not a single Palestinian left allowed to remain in West Jerusalem. So, but you walk around, and I remember as a kid, there'd be falafel stands everywhere. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew that falafel was not an Israeli food. I didn't even know that falafel had anything to do with Palestine. You know, it's that deep. It's that serious. You know, half of the words, the slang words in Hebrew, if not all, are Arabic words. It didn't occur to us that they're Arabic. And so that's just how deep this appropriation is. And the idea is, we have come in, and it's all ours, and it's all us, and anybody else has no place here, you know. So yalla is a Hebrew word. Falafel is an Israeli food. You know, it came to a place where in America, when you have Jewish weddings, they serve falafel and baba ganoush and stuff like that, you know, and hummus, because it's Jewish food. It suddenly became Jewish food. That's just how deep it is. And the problem is not only, and of course, the history of Palestine. I mean, you go through Palestine, there's so many lovely and incredible historical sites. Whatever is not, everything is Roman. Everything is Roman or Greek, or maybe Byzantine. There's not a single Palestinian ruin. There's nothing. There's no Dahr al-Omar. There's nothing. Akka is all, nothing. Tabariya was not, people don't even know that Tabariya was an Arab city because there are no Arabs there. Safa, there's no Arabs there. Everybody's gone. So how could it be? How could it possibly have been an Arab city? Yes, we have Roman and Byzantine and lots of Jewish ruins, lots of Jewish ruins everywhere. That's the reality there. And of course, when people study about this here in America, in social studies, in public schools, that's what they learn. Certainly Israelis in schools and at home, that's what we learn. So it's so deep that there's not even an awareness that it's taking place. That's how deep and effective it is. And, it's a tough hill to climb for those of us that are trying to decolonize, talk about decolonization, that aspect of it. King David Street in Silwan. Silwan is a huge Palestinian town, just outside the old city of Jerusalem. Over 50,000 people. It's a big town. Suddenly you have a King David Street, and it makes nobody thinks anything of, why is there a King David Street in the middle of Silwan, But that's how they do it. Suddenly all the street names are changing. The Silwan is not Silwan, it's the city of David. All of these things are taking place at a level that and somehow it's all acceptable. So they're very, very effective. And absolutely, this is a huge part of the genocide, not just the ethnic cleansing, but the genocide, because it's killing the people and it's killing their memory and their history, or they're trying to. Thankfully, they're not successful, but that's what they're trying to do.
I would say they're extremely successful. But the Israelis, I don't like to say the Jews because I think it's a misnomer, but the Israelis, they misappropriated our land. And then after they misappropriated our land, they kicked out 2/3 of our people violently. And then after they kicked out 2/3 of people, they left that 1/3 to kind of service them as second and third class citizens, however you want to define it. Meanwhile, taking all of our culture, misappropriating everything we have, actually. So today, I grew up in America. I'm from the capital of the United States. Two of my best friends are Jewish growing up. I used to go to school with them. Hebrew school, I went to all the bar mitzvahs and the bat mitzvahs. People were serving gefilte fish. People were not serving, they were not serving hummus and baba ganoush and falafel, but the Israelis pushed it. I was in Paris a few years ago, 14 restaurants opened up within the same month, a hummus bar, a falafel bar. They're all Israeli restaurants. This is misappropriation of our food, misappropriation of our culture, misappropriation of our land, misappropriation of our actual identity. I have a guy from Poland telling me that hummus is his and falafel is his and the kufia is theirs. And, they actually go so far as to patent and trademark all this stuff, by the way. It's fantastic. They're brilliant. They really are brilliant. But it's our identity and it's our culture, and we need to fight back for it. We need to fight hard for it, because we fell again into the propaganda train. So now everyone thinks couscous and hummus and all this stuff is Israeli. It's become Israeli, but that's because Palestinians don't exist to be Israeli. So how could it be Palestinian, right?
Just clarify, when I said they succeeded or they didn't succeed, the majority of the people in Palestine are still Palestinians. And when you talk to, even here in America, if you go to a conference where there's Palestinian kids, you ask them where they're from, they'll tell you the village where their grandparents came from. Yeah. You know what I mean? So in that regard, and in Palestine, certainly people do know that. So when I said they didn't succeed, I meant they didn't they did not succeed in that respect.
No, they succeeded on the international market, and that's the market that matters.
So now that we're talking about the international market, and also I think individual Palestinians keeping that identity alive, how do we see art as a form of Palestinian resistance? How do we see this across the world? And if any of you identify yourself as an artist, I know Lena, you're a self-proclaimed fashionista. How do you personally use art to proudly claim your Palestinian identity?
Okay, first of all, I'm really not a self-proclaimed fashionista. I've just loved fashion since I was a little
girl. Call you a fashionista.
But thank you. I appreciate being called that. Yeah. But actually, so in my specialty, my legal specialty is negotiations. And within my specialty, I'm qualified in nonverbal communication. Let's just say it's one of my fortes is nonverbal communication. What I find and what I think we can do is get the nonverbal communication out, because when it's nonverbal, it's obviously less aggressive to start with. So nonverbal communication is very important. And within the world of nonverbal communication, you have different mediums. I think art is a very important medium. I happen to work with a lot of amazing artists, not necessarily Palestinian, but European mostly. I've been involved in a lot of in the art world through a buyer that I've spent a lot of time with. So I've been involved in the art world and in fashion and food, and I think this part of our identity is, first of all, nonverbal, and second of all, people will take it easier as a peace offering than us, demonstrating sometimes in the street. Sometimes it's easier to look at a piece of art like this, which is a piece by Khalid Jarrar, who is a former bodyguard to Yasser Arafat, was with him until he died in Paris and then decided to study art. And he won a prize in 2013 for this piece. And I think that it's very important that we support our Palestinian artists and that we actually understand and accept it as a mean and a method to also get a message across. Unfortunately, I don't think that there are enough Palestinian artists in the world that are fighting for the cause. So, and on the right side of history. I think neutrality, to me personally, is a sort of betrayal. When you're too neutral on a situation like Palestine, especially if you're Palestinian, it's not a good sign either. So I encourage, any forms of art, whether it's singing or dancing or, I actually wanted to be the next Madonna when I was 14, but my mother wouldn't let me because she's a banker. And so she chose banking, Zionism. And then for me, she chose law, another very typical Zionist kind of profession in the capital. So, she wanted me to have that. But I do think that it would be great to have a Palestinian Madonna or what have you. But these things just encourage, but people have to come out too. You can't just be Palestinian and famous. You got to scream that you're Palestinian. You've got to say free Palestine every day. You've got to let people know that we're not letting go, that we're not letting go of our identity. It's very, very important. And you guys, especially because you're on the campus environment, you can do it, no problem at all. I remember when I was head of the whatever in university, whatever organization, and we made in GUPS, we made these t-shirts, Hard Rock Cafe t-shirts. I mean, there's so many things you can do, to get the message across non-verbally, just walking down the courtyard wearing, a Hard Rock Cafe t-shirt that says, Gaza and the West Bank. It's a statement, and this is very important, So we've got to focus on this, and it's really up to you guys also, because everyone else, by the way, is too afraid. People are afraid to express themselves.
Well, in the music world, there's Dam, there's the 47 Soul, there's so much, and then literature, Ibrahim Nasrallah, Susan Abul Hawa. There's so much Palestinian. Or just look at the wall. When I was in Gaza, you look at the graffiti.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing, the graffiti. Yeah.
And so there's so much of it, and I think it's again, the people I know are people who kind of agree with me. So I don't know what it looks like from somebody on the outside and what kind of exposure goes beyond. But there's some fabulous Palestinian art, and I think it's all resistance. I'm no expert, but that's what I think.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of good art. I mean, we don't see it enough, and it's not out there enough. You have, galleries like AM, a gallery who definitely features some Palestinian artists. But in general, I'd have to say,
like Haifa, there's lots of stuff.
But I mean, how are we going to have access to that? I'm talking about on a worldwide scale. I mean, it would be great to see Palestinian artists like Khalid Jarrar, who was in the FIAC, who, these people at BAL, the most important art fairs. I mean, it would be great. But I mean, any level of art, whether it's singing, dancing, painting, it's all great. My experience in my family is that they really pushed us to have some hardcore degrees, that we could have as ammunition since we have no country. So the idea was with my grandfather and my mother, who has 5 degrees. Can you imagine? My mother has 5 degrees. The idea was just to stack up as many diplomas in your mind as you can, because at any given moment you could be kicked out of your home. So they still have that, you know, persecuted mentality. And so we were all kind of conditioned to be doctors and lawyers and engineers, and you know, that was more the norm, let's say, in the US, than artists, so to speak.
I can completely relate to that. I'm a
Can you?
self-proclaimed artist now, but growing up, my father told me that I had 3 options: engineering, medicine, or law. And then
Yeah, same.
I graduated from business school, and guess what? I'm an artist.
Well, that's great, but you have ammunition because you have a solid degree in your
Right.
brain, and no one can take it away from you. They can
Right.
take anything else away from you,
Right.
but they can't take
Can't
that
take
away from you.
Great. So I grew up with that, but I think art definitely holds. It also strengthens, I think, the Palestinian communities of the diaspora very strongly, because it is often a gateway for us to understand our culture and then start exploring our history and our painful history, which, you know, sometimes we don't always talk about. So thank you so much. I learned so much. But Diana, would you like to add to that?
Not really, other than to say that, you know, that we one of the things that that Israel tries to do is they want to erase us, and they want to erase us from the earth, both physically and then all of the vestiges of us. And so this is why, you know, as Miko was saying, people don't know that Tabariya is Tabariya because there aren't any Palestinians there anymore. Or why they demolished thousands of homes and wiped off more than 500 towns and villages off the map, because they don't want us to be there, and they want to appropriate and pretend that they were the ones who were there. That was the whole ethos of Zionism, is to land for people without a land. And so the idea is to try to erase this. Now culture is in all different forms. It's everything from traditional, cultural, from traditional cultural art to the things that are a little bit less, less sort of formalistic and traditional. That it's not only having a revival, but it's our attempt at survival as well. And even that has been subjected to a lot of repression. For example, there's a lot of different types of herbs, of vegetables that are indigenous to Palestine that Israel will not let us forage or pick, because they want to cut off that tie that we have with our land. Things like za'atar, it's illegal here to pick za'atar. To akub, to other things that they've literally tried to block our connection to our land. And so for us here, it's not only important for us to hold on to it and to, as you said, use it as the tool of expression, to delve deep into our own very painful history, but it's also a form of our very survival, particularly here in Palestine. In the diaspora, it's so important to have that connection between us who still remain in Palestine and those who were kicked out of Palestine, to hold on to those traditions, the stories, and transform them into things that blend who we are as a people today, people of a diaspora, in the diaspora now. And so it's so vitally important that we not just look at culture and art as being this section, but it's so defined by politics, and it's so political. Saying that you're Palestinian is so political. Being a Palestinian artist is so political, and it's imperative that we continue to do it. That not only that we scream it from the rooftops, but if we don't hold on to it, it's going to be very soon. Already, just one last thing. Already, I was aware of tatriz. Even tatriz, even the hatta, the kufiya, is now being appropriated. Leave aside the mughrabi, the couscous, leave aside the falafel, leave aside the hummus, leave aside the baba ghanoush, leave aside all of the food things. But it's the things that that really stand out as symbols that they're also trying to appropriate and trying to crush as well. And so it's so important for us to hold on to it and to make sure that we do not escape this earth, and that they're not able to erase us.
You know, I wanna just add two little things. One is the book I mentioned earlier, the Palestinian refugees in international law. One of the things that they, you know, how Palestinians say, "Akhaduha mafrusha," they took the land, you know, furnished. In that book, they demonstrate precisely the wealth, the riches that were present, and that the Zionists took, and how it helped them to develop a state that was a functional state, because they were able to steal so much. And when we talk about that, there's the cultural heritage too. There are the cities, there's the monuments, there are the street art, the things that exist outside, plazas and things like that were there. They were all taken. And so I mean, reading that book really gives a really good understanding of what was there, and of course the culture and the art and everything, the politics, the property, the farming, you know, because they describe exactly what was taken, and it's above and beyond what most people realize. Even if people understand that this was not a barren land that became green thanks to the Zionists, still the wealth that existed and was stolen, and which is again described in that book, is above and beyond what most people appreciate. Another thing I want to mention, you know, there's this pretty radical Israeli NGO called Zochrot, and they have this Envision Return project now, which is wonderful. It's very powerful, and it's not just the return of the people. It's not just the return of the people to their ancestral homeland, to their towns and their villages and so on, but it's a return of Palestine, because it's more than just the people. It's and maybe it sounds a little bit naive, but I think it's important to check it out and to kind of be part of that, because it's very optimistic, and I think it's important, you know, when things are so depressing, to be optimistic. And the return to and there's this whole project of envisioning what the villages are going to look like once the return happens. They're not going to be exactly the way they were, because now it's a 21st century. But this whole project is a really, really positive one, and I encourage people to take a look at Zochrot website and check it out, because it helps to take this whole issue of a decolonized Palestine, a return, the possibilities that exist, to a level where it's actually a practical thing that we talk about and discuss, as opposed to something that people will refer to as, well, that's just, that's dreams, that's never going to happen, which even Palestinians say a lot. So again, that book, which really lists the wealth that was there, and I think even a lot of Palestinians don't realize, and then the Zochrot project to really start envisioning what the return will look like.
In return, we will, inshallah.
Yeah.
With that, I would like to say thank you so much for all of the three of you. Honestly inspired me so much. It's been a rough couple months for Palestinians, especially Palestinians of the diaspora, who feel like powerless often feel like, what can we do? It's a lost cause, but it's important for us to continue to imagine a free Palestine, because we will see a free Palestine. I have many questions, some of them selected for me from PSC members and the UBC group. So first question is, it's a long one, so bear with me. Article 1 of the 4th Geneva Convention requires Canada to ensure, as high signatory, to ensure the convention is upheld in all circumstances and domestically in Canada. The Special Economic Measures Act, and the Special Economic Measures Act calls for sanctions on foreign states who commit gross and systemic human rights violations. Any suggestions on how we can call for international accountability? Miko, would you speak about Israeli foreign recruiting in Canada and elsewhere? And what is the role of using the law? This question is from Karen.
Yeah, well, I guess there's the campaign, a really good really important campaign in Canada, with some really important signatories that talks about the fact that Israel is allowed to recruit young Canadians to the IDF. So never mind the fact that that should not be legal anyway. The IDF should be designated a terrorist organization. It should not even be designated as a legitimate military force because it is a terrorist organization that engages in terrorism. So just because they're not scrappy and they've got nice uniforms and big tanks doesn't mean that they're not a terrorist organization. Quite the opposite. I think it's a really, really important campaign. I think people should check it out. And again, the law always somehow Israel is exempt from these laws. I don't know why Israel is always exempt from the laws. It's almost like you would say, well, if somebody's Jewish, they should never go to jail, even if they commit a crime. Israel, because they're Jews, everything falls under the new IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, so they're exempt from everything. It is illegal. It is illegal. The people who engage in these kind of acts should be, should be brought to justice. I think it's really, really important. But again, somehow politicians and even the institutions of law somehow always give some kind of an exemption to Israel, give an exemption to Zionists. And so I agree that these are important campaigns and that should definitely follow the letter of the law when it comes to Israel on all these issues.
So how can we call for international accountability?
Well, that's what BDS does, really. I mean, that's what BDS does. BDS calls for international accountability to stop doing business with an apartheid regime, just like they did. Now, I like to remind people that the campaign against apartheid, the BDS campaign against apartheid in South Africa was a very, very tough uphill battle that nobody, people were spitting blood before they saw any kind of success. And even as late as 88, 89, if anybody would have suggested that Nelson Mandela within 5 years would be president of South Africa, nobody would have believed it. So that teaches us two things. Number one, it's a tough battle, and it's a tough battle. We need to get in there. We need to organize. We need to be smart, and we need to stand up. And number two, we don't really know what is going to be the thing that tops it over. We don't really know. We could be meeting here 4 years from now, and there's a whole new reality of a free Palestine. We don't know that, and so we need to keep pushing as hard as we can. We need to be working as smart as we can, and in places where the laws are already in place, like in Canada, like what you described, even in America, to sell weapons to a state that uses those weapons the way Israel does is illegal. Right. But Israel somehow gets an exemption. So we need to just keep doing what we're doing, but more of it. And again, BDS comes to mind. That is how we call the world to stand up.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to add to answer that question?
Did you want me to? I can answer the legal part of it.
Yeah, of course, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll give some background to those who don't know what it is. So Israel as an occupier has to abide by the laws of occupation. The laws of occupation are contained in something called the Fourth Geneva Convention. And the Fourth Geneva Convention spells out exactly what Israel cannot do. It cannot build settlements. It cannot steal land. It cannot build Israeli bypass roads. It can't demolish Palestinian homes. What it has to do as an occupier is everything that it has to do has to be for the benefit of the people that they're occupying, i.e. the Palestinians, and not for the benefit of Israeli settlers and so on and so forth. Now, part of the Fourth Geneva Convention, one of the prime articles in it, says that when it comes to occupation, this isn't just an imperative that's placed, it's not just rules that are placed on the occupier, but that other countries as well have an obligation, third parties have an obligation as well to make sure that the occupation is being carried out legally and not illegally. Occupation by its nature is not illegal, by the way. And so what it says is that third parties have to make sure that they have an obligation to make sure that the laws of occupation are not being violated. That means Canada. Canada is a third party, and it means that it has an obligation. Now, this isn't just spelled out in the Fourth Geneva Convention, but the case I was telling you about, the 2004 wall case, the case that declares that Israel's wall is illegal, also really hits home and says that third parties, I mean, that is to say third states, not just Israel, are also required to make sure that, that the laws of occupation are not being violated. The big problem is that there is a difference between legal and there's political. And so countries know, such as Canada, they know what they're supposed to be doing, but they've politically taken a decision not to do what they're supposed to be doing. And this is why it becomes so important for us as activists to be pushing on these two fronts, one on the grassroots level, but also pushing in terms of governments and what it is that their obligations are and what their responsibilities are. Because left to their own devices, they're just going to turn around and say, well, we think that this is a matter that needs to be decided between the parties, as though people who are living under military rule somehow have the ability to kick out their oppressor and occupier, and they don't. It requires third-party intervention. This is why BDS is so important. So it's very important for us to be organizing and to make sure that that people understand what Canada's role is. Canada is not just a person who it's not just a country that is sitting back and looking and, you know, putting one hand on the other and saying, oh, well, this is up to the two parties to resolve it. Given that they are not doing anything to stop it, they're implicated. And it's so important for us to really continue to press home and to make sure that Canada is upholding its responsibilities as well. And that they're undertaking their obligations. Now, whether this is something that you do through activism and by pressing your members of parliament, or whether it's through whether you're trying to get it through the media or through court or otherwise, this is all very, very, very important. I found that in the past, I'm just speaking from personal experience, that I noticed that when the last election was happening in Canada, the last federal election in Canada was happening, that that people were giving Trudeau a lot of a pass because he is not as bad as the alternative. The problem is that he takes for granted us as Palestinians and us as a movement. And then just says a couple of, you know, words in Arabic here and there, and people give him a pass. And I know this is probably not the case with the people who are on this call, but it's so important for us to really make sure that people like Trudeau are paying a price, and that they know that our votes are not cheap, our voices are not cheap, and that we also demand accountability, and we demand that Canada also play the role that it should be playing. I'll stop there. There's much more I can say about it, but I'll stop there because I know there's questions.
Of course, I would also, I think what you said was very important, and I'd like to point out to our viewers that our politicians work for us. We elected them. And as we saw that Joe Biden recently got elected, and the same thing goes in America, right? Just because Joe Biden isn't as bad as the current president, it doesn't mean that we can't hold him accountable and hold them accountable, because our voices are not cheap. Thank you, Diana. So our second question is, Israel has been successful to date in resisting decisions of international fora that accurately describe it as an apartheid-like state, that Zionism is a racist ideology, or that it is guilty of crimes against humanity. Do the panel think that there is any chance now of gaining international confirmation, i.e. under the 1973 UN Convention of the Prohibition of Apartheid, or the 1948 UN Convention on the Prohibition of Genocide, to take forward the campaign for human rights? And if so, how? This question is from Dave.
Well, that's what IHRA came to do, protect Israel precisely from that. In other words, you know, they have, if one thing you can say about the Zionists, they have foresight. They know what they're doing. You know, I'm sure they're out there right now already with the Biden camp, making sure that he doesn't reverse all of Trump's, you know, policies, the defunding UNRWA and closing the Palestinian mission in DC and stuff like that. I'm sure they're already there doing it. They know, they got foresight. The IHRA came precisely the definition in order to prevent that, because if you say that Israel is engaged in racism, then you're anti-Semitic now. And all of these states and non-governmental organizations have accepted the definition. So now they're, you know what I mean? They put themselves in a bind. They cannot go out and say Israel is a racist state, Israel is engaged in genocide, because they themselves accepted this definition. That's precisely what they did. They tied their hands and now they gagged themselves. That's precisely what this is about. I mean, I don't think we should, by any stretch of the imagination, stop fighting this and stop campaigning for this. And perhaps a new administration here in the US, there'll be another, the doors will be slightly more open for people like ourselves to go out there and fight and speak. But yeah, this is a tough uphill battle, and they are prepared, and they're building walls, and they're building all these, realities that make it even harder and harder and harder to criticize them and hold them accountable. It doesn't mean that we should stop. We should just work harder and smarter too.
Would anybody like to add to that before we continue? Okay. So our third question, thank you so much, Miko. Our third question is related to our new president-elect, Joe Biden. Now that Joe Biden is president of the United States, do you think that the normalization of relations of Arab countries with Israel will stop? And if the deals agreed with Trump will not come to a reality? So we touched upon it a little earlier, but if you folks could answer that question.
Well, he's not president yet, but
well, President-elect Joe Biden. So do we think that his election will continue the normalization with Arab nations and Israel, or if the deals that were agreed to with Trump, will they come to a reality?
Look, I think it's going to be a little bit. Oh, sorry, Lena. You go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I personally would advise everyone in the audience to watch the APEC speeches and to listen to Joe Biden and to listen to Kamala Harris. And I think from those speeches, it's very clear their position and what we can expect over the next 4 years. Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Diana.
No, Miko, please.
I was just going to add to that at the same time, the people they bring in with them, it depends on who they bring in with them. We know that on certain issues like immigration reform and stuff like that, there's a good chance that they're going to be bringing in a lot more progressive voices on some of these other issues. Who knows? They might be intending to, and again, it depends on how far they want to piss off Netanyahu. I mean, are they going to go back to the Iran deal? The Iran deal was one of Barack Obama's major foreign policy achievements, if you will. Are they going to go back to that? Because if they go back to that, they're already pissing off Israel. Then are they going to allow the Palestinians to open a diplomatic mission in DC? Are they going to go back and fund UNRWA? In other words, there's a gap there between what they say and claim when they're speaking to AIPAC, which politicians have to do, and who are the people that are actually going to be executing the policies on the ground, and how much room will there be for us to push ourselves in? And we'll see. I think it depends on who the people that they bring in, and on our willingness to step in and push the door as far open as we can.
Thank you, Diana.
Yeah, look, I think we can't underestimate just how devastating the past 4 years have been on Palestinians in terms of this administration, and the things that they've done were things that are permanent. For example, the moving of the embassy. Biden is not going to be the person who moves the embassy back. There would have been no U.S. president who would have moved it back. The whole Trump plan was not a plan. It was an implementation mechanism designed to implement exactly Israel's wish list. And the fact that it has been stopped is important. So they won't move the embassy back. That's for certain. But there might be other things that they will do, such as restore funding to UNRWA, reopening the embassy. Maybe, I'm not so sure about when they declare Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. I can see them undoing that as well. But that stuff is the minor stuff. I think the bigger picture issue, it's minor in this, I don't want to say it's minor. A lot of people, millions of people are impacted by this. So I don't want to downplay it. But in terms of the bigger picture, it's smaller in terms of size. The bigger issue really rests, Yasmin, on what it is that Palestinians are going to now demand. And the big problem has been that we've had a Palestinian Authority that has really just been living from one administration to another administration, demanding negotiations and more negotiations and more negotiations. So I think a lot of what this administration is going to do, this new US administration's new US regime is going to do, depends a lot on what it is that the Palestinian leadership is going to be pushing for. If they bring their ceiling down, as I suspect they will, and say, yes, we're ready to go back and negotiate with Israel. Yes, we're ready to have security collaboration with Israel. And I fear this. Then that's all that this administration, Biden, Harris, are going to do. But if they push for something greater, and this is really the time for them to be rethinking and re-strategizing, then we may see something different. Not so much from Biden and from Harris, because I don't expect that liberation is going to come through them. But I do think that this is now the time that we as Palestinians and this Palestinian leadership really needs to be rethinking what the strategy is and be pushing forward on that level. I can't see them undoing everything that Trump has done, but I do think that this is time for us not to just be saying, oh, thank you, Biden, now we just want to go back to negotiations, and instead to be pushing for something much, much, much greater than that.
And I will just add to that, I agree completely. And I would just add to that, that really it is so obvious. All that we need to do is point out the obvious. The racism of the Zionist state is so apparent. It is so obvious. It is people, like Diana, you were describing earlier, people talk about it in the street with pride. They don't have a problem. The discourse is so racist. No one is even trying to hide it. The violence by the IDF is so apparent, is so horrifying. All you do is you point it out and you say, well, okay, now there's a new administration that says that they want to, believe in human rights. It supports civil rights. Well, look, so I agree. I don't think they're going to change the embassy, take back the embassy, although I think most of the embassy never actually moved. I think most of the embassy is still in Tel Aviv. But some things they're not going to do, and perhaps they will do some of those other things. But it's an opportunity for us to say, wait a minute. If you're going to move back, even back to the Obama days, take a look at the big picture here. How could you possibly support this? How could you possibly send money to this? How could you not condition aid, at least condition aid with some semblance of compliance with international law? So there's an opportunity for us to just say, look, it's all there. Israel does all the work for us. We don't really have to do much, but point in the direction and say, look, it's all here. It's all so obvious. This has nothing to do with hating anybody. This is just saying, look, do something about this. So I think who knows, but I think there might be an opportunity here for us, because there's a sense, a lot of people are very much relieved and want to see change and want to see things moving in the right direction. We need to jump on that. We need to jump on that bus and say, well, Palestine too.
Right.
Don't forget Palestine.
Can't be a progressive without supporting a free Palestine. I always like to say that.
Absolutely. Or even
I also have a little bit of faith in progressives that were elected in this last election, and continue to show support, such as our Ilhan Omar. As we can't forget our sister Rashida Tlaib in office now too. So reelected.
She was reelected. They were all reelected, and now they've got some reinforcements as well. In other words, others were elected that speak in the same language. So I think this is we have
an exciting time. It's time for us to continue organizing. That's what I'm hearing. So I'm ready to hit the streets, COVID or not. So our fourth and last question, it's another long one. So you folks love to write. As a Canadian supporter of Palestinian rights, we have just had the IHRA definition forced through by the Ontario government, as mentioned earlier, in the most undemocratic fashion, and the Zionist movement is very large here in Toronto. Palestinian organizers are feeling overwhelmed by losing the battle for free speech, as those who speak out are attacked both personally and professionally. How do we defeat the Zionist lobby? Also, how do you think that globally the fight for Palestinian human rights will gain more momentum? I'm opening up the floor for everybody.
Look, maybe I'll open up by saying, first, we're on the right side of history, and it's important to keep that in mind. You know, I don't think that people, the people who are not living in Canada, I'm not sure how much they realize that actually Canada is a lot more Zionist than the US is. It shocks people when they hear me say this, but having lived in both places, I can say very confidently that Canada is pretty Zionist, and the impact that the Zionists have is it's polite, but it's very Zionist. You know, they're not the AIPAC out in your face, but it's very under and very effective, and just as evil. And I definitely feel for all the people who have had the attacks on them personally and professionally. I know that many of you have had threats against your workplaces, death threats, and so on. I also experienced that when I was living in Canada and when I was an activist. And it's not a consolation to say that it will be defeated when you're in the midst of it, because I know how intimidating it is. That said, it will be defeated, and I think that the best ways of going about it is to expand, and it's already happening, to expand our solidarity circles. In the past, solidarity was much wider, and then in the 90s it kind of like shrunk a little bit, and now of course our solidarity circles are opening up. And the more that we open up our solidarity circles, us and others, and like it goes both ways, right? It goes multiple ways. The safer that it is for us, and the louder our voices become. And it's so vital for people to understand that this issue isn't just about free speech. They often couch it as just a free speech issue. This is not about free speech. This is about our ability to even exist. And because it's about our ability to exist and to be able to live, it's so important for us to be working in concert with others and to show exactly what the trajectory is. Like, where is it that we are going along this path? If this type of legislation can pass in Ontario without so much as a debate, in the totally undemocratic way that it passed, imagine what is next. Imagine what is next. And so it's so important for us to be, expanding our circles, expanding our the groups of people that we work with, and for people to see that this isn't just about us as Palestinians, but it's about us as humans, and about where it is that this world is intending to take us. Just in the same way that they can try to shut down any criticism when it comes to Israel, so too we're going to see that our ability to have any influence on other issues, not just on Palestine, by the way, is also going to be affected. And it's and so I would encourage you to really focus on getting that bigger, wider, etc. And we're not alone. It's amazing to me just how much people, I'll get people who will reach out to me and ask, how is it that I can help? They're outraged because of the things that they are seeing happening, not just to us, but they can see where it's going to be taking us in the future. And that gives me a lot of positive, a lot of comfort. The Zionists focus their efforts. It's always a small thing. They're not expanding in numbers. We see, based on independent Jewish voices and other groups that are forming in Canada and elsewhere, that actually young Jews are actually not going down the path of Zionism, and that's also freaking them out. And our strength is in our numbers, and we just need to keep expanding those circles. In the process, take care of yourself. Oftentimes, you know, Jasmine, you were saying this at the beginning, like you want to show that that it's okay and you can withstand, etc. We're all human at the end of the day, and you've got to take care of yourself, and making sure that we as activists take care of ourselves and take care of one another is so vitally important, that we label the things that are happening to us and against us, and that we make sure that these things are known and reported, and that we get the love and support that we need to continue to push on for the fight. And my mother always says, there's a reason that you have a choir, so that one voice can drop off and everybody else continue the tune. And that's what we have to continue to do. Wow. One voice will drop off because they need to take a breath, but we all continue along that tune.
Amen.
Wow, that's so beautiful.
It is.
Wow. Would anybody like to add to that, Diana? Wow, I found that very inspiring. Self-love is definitely revolutionary when you dedicate your life to, you know, freeing Palestine and taking care of community. And I can't emphasize that enough, especially as a recent grad from post-secondary, who's still, you know, fighting. But
there's another question there that I want to comment on. Is that okay?
Of course, please feel free.
It's about the trial of the Holy Land Foundation 5 and how it's an extension of Zionism. I think I just wrote a book about them, you know. So I mean, to me that's like that's touching a nerve. The Holy Land Foundation, and the book is called Injustice: The Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5, and it's a story. It's everybody. It's our worst fears as activists, as people who fight, who stand up and speak for Palestine. Maybe not me, because I'm the white privileged guy, but certainly for Palestinians, for people who are not white skinned and privileged, who are activists, who do make this enormous sacrifice to do what's right. This is the worst fear, because these are 5 of the finest people you will ever meet, who did nothing wrong ever, being accused of the worst crimes and receiving the most frightening punishment, to be sent to federal prison on terrorism charges, treated in the worst possible way, spending months, enormous amounts of time in solitary confinement, and only because they're Palestinians and Muslims. In other words, these are men who who will never go back to Palestine. They are part of the diaspora. They were kicked out, and they were still being persecuted in the new country, in their new homeland, for doing just the right thing and giving back to the community, which was, they ran a charity organization, the Holy Land Foundation, which was highly respected, highly regarded, an enormous, tremendous amount of good all over the world, not only in Palestine, or focused in Palestine. And now these guys are in federal prison. 2 of them, Abdurrahman Aoudi and Mohammed al-Mazain, received 15-year sentences, and they should be released by the end of this year. I believe that Abdurrahman is actually being released this month. 2 of them received 65 years. 65 years in federal prison. Shukri Abu Bakr and Ghassan Ilashi. Fine men, fine fathers, wonderful figures. And then Mufid Abdul Qadir, who was found completely not guilty on all charges in one trial, and was retried and found guilty and serving 20 years. It is the worst nightmare, really. And they had gone through it, and they're still going through it. And the question is, how do we bring back awareness? Well, I'll say, get my book and give it out to, send it out to people, because it's a horrifying story. And the only reason these men are in prison is because they're Palestinians and Muslim. If they were white, if they were Christian, if they were Jewish, doing the exact same thing or worse, because Zionist organizations that contribute to settlements, that send money, like the Kushners and the Friedmans and others, David Friedman, who send money to the worst of the worst, and support the terrorism that takes place in Palestine, you know, nobody would even dream of prosecuting them. So I really appreciate the fact that Samah Nasser brought up this question, because it is such a horrifying story. And they were, you know, these 5 men were monumental to the community. These are 5 pillars of the Muslim and Arab and Palestinian community in America. And they were taken down by, you know, by the American judicial system, but really the Zionist organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and other were behind it. So please, you know, talk about them, think about them. You can write to them. And again, if you get my book, all the information is there. Again, thank you for raising that, because, you know, it shows how the persecution of Palestinians didn't end in Palestine. It continues in the new countries that they've chosen to live in, that they're living in as well.
I know your book was linked in the chat, and a lot of the other resources that many of you mentioned, and artists and books were all mentioned in the chat. So to our viewers, please make sure to check all of that out. And thank you so much for sharing, Nico. With that being said, I appreciate everybody for attending, and especially our panelists. Thank you so much. I definitely have a huge boost of inspiration and energy coming from this call or from this webinar. So thank you so much for everyone for attending. Just a reminder that this event was actually hosted by SPHR at UBC, all the way at British Columbia, and the Palestinian Solidarity Collective at York University in Toronto. So if you're interested to keep up to date with the 2 clubs, make sure to check them out on social media at UBC, SPHR, and PSC_YorkU. That's on Instagram. Also, make sure to keep up to date with all of their amazing works. I'm talking about the panelists. Follow them on social media, check out the websites, keep up to date, because they share many resources and knowledge, and we can learn so much from their organizing and work that they continue to do. All of the links are in the chat. And for our panelists, we have a special request. The organizers would like to thank you personally. So if you could stay behind, and to everybody else, please exit the webinar because it's the end. So thank you so much again for attending, and make sure to follow us on social media to keep up to date with all of the events coming up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for moderating, and thanks for all the great questions. And thanks to Lena and Miko as well.